Hi, everyone. And this week we're talking about True Grit. A 14-year-old girl's father is murdered in cold blood, and she goes after the killer. They're soon joined by a Texas Marshal. So that's this week's discussion. I'm John Chang, and we have Dan Edmonds once again.
Hi.
I think this time, one of the things, like to me, between what we've talked about in the past and now is how there's some different threads. Like here we have like a revenge story, which like kind of goes really to our discussion with Old Boy, having that main central plot and stuff like that. And on top of it is also kind of course the Old West, and we'll kind of I'm sure throughout the rest of our talk go into a lot of different layers and stuff. So yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like for you, what was it that kind of like really echoed back to some of our past discussions, and then we'll kind of course dive into the main parts of this one and stuff, this week's movie.
Yeah, no, there were lots of things in this that were really tied us back to previous talks. Obviously, it's a film of revenge. That's the main story. Just like Old Boy, we're also dealing with surrogate father figures,
Yeah.
which was another point that we had in Old Boy. In terms of the violence as a kind of a something that people had to get used to as part of a daily event. That's almost a bit sort of going back to rollerball in a way, and the people have been sort of like come to terms with these extreme sort of levels of violence in their lives.
Right.
So those are the main sort of ones that came to mind.
Yeah, I think rollerball is a great metaphor for how we would kind of. I remember talking a little bit about the Wild West atmosphere for when they were the remake in out there in Eastern Europe and stuff. And I guess that's the thing that like the Wild West really is a metaphor a lot of times for whenever we talk about something that like the rules are like kind of really up in the air, and like when we talk about like kind of anything from the internet, like kind of when back to like kind of 2000 2001 and stuff like that, like kind of people constantly refer to the internet as being the Wild West. And I think that's the thing that like is still even though westerns aren't as big nowadays, but when we think of like kind of things being very much where the rules are kind of just really arbitrary and stuff like that, we talk about Wild West as being the terminology that we use for that.
Yeah, and that's of course the interesting point with Westworld is that you almost feel
Right.
a whole TV show is underpinned by this idea that technology has kind of run away from us and we don't really have a control, and it's kind of
Yeah.
companies like Facebook do just seem completely unaccountable for their actions, which
Yeah.
is to the Wild West. That was what I took out of it. But yeah, I mean, this was. I think the one thing I didn't realize about this was that it was written a year before the film, the original, was made.
Right.
So we were actually looking at the late '60s. This is the Vietnam
Yeah.
War, and when we talk about people trying to get to grips with daily acceptance of violence, I wonder how much of this is
Mm.
a reflection of this because in this you've got the 14-year-old girl who's been exploited at every turn by older men, women, anyone really. You've got people being hanged in the streets, and justice meted out in a sheriff who can, just shoots first, asks questions later. And you've got, youth and innocent, charity like Cheney is met with betrayal. That's really what triggers the whole thing, is
Right.
like the father's kindness ultimately ends up getting him killed. So, these all kind of like underpin this whole idea that it's just completely lawless. Um, so yeah, that was what I got from it. Really, there must have been some kind of this sort of turning away, thinking that society can't necessarily look after you all the time.
And into the mix, we throw a 14-year-old girl, and that's an interesting choice because I feel like the book wouldn't work as well, or and for that matter, of course, the movies wouldn't work as well with a 14-year-old boy for some reason. And I don't know if like kind of if you feel that way, like kind of, or to me, like there's something about that, about a girl in that role that like it's kind of really striking as to maybe just the fact that like she's doing something that's not only challenging enough for a 14-year-old, but it's like it's almost like amplifies things because it's a girl and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a girl who's vulnerable. She doesn't, in that particular society, she really doesn't hold much power. She has to sort of negotiate and deal from a point of real sort of weakness compared to a lot of other people who she wants to enact this revenge with. So that kind of gets heightened, and I think it's just this idea of I think generally it's a teenage girl is going to be more vulnerable than a teenage boy in sort of a generalized perception, especially in the late 60s. So it kind of heightens this idea that she's using her wits and her guile to really get what she wants and to try and get these people to go with her on this revenge.
Yeah, I mean, in that time period, women didn't have a whole lot of rights. I mean, basically they were like, I guess, one bare step above property, right? Like kind of in the Old West and stuff like that. But meanwhile, though, we kind of find that she's not only was responsible mainly for the household, for back home and stuff like that. She was pretty much like in fact, one of the conversations I remember that stands out in my mind is that she's basically sending back, I guess, a servant or somebody who came with her to collect the body of her dad, and then she says, make sure mom doesn't sign anything and stuff like that. And so I thought that was a striking comment, like kind of like it's something that like you rarely would hear, even nowadays, much less like I think back then and stuff. But somehow she was in this position of not only authority, but she was the decision maker for that household apparently. So.
Yeah, certainly second only to the dad, I would say.
Right.
Yeah. And he obviously entrusts her to do the books.
Yes.
And so she's a very strong, kind of clever lead character as a 14-year-old, really, which is a really interesting choice. And I think it kind of heightens this whole thing of lawlessness in that you've got someone, normally a 14-year-old girl would not be allowed to go out and seek revenge, but it obviously wasn't completely unheard of it just sort of reinforces that whole idea that anything kind of goes in the West.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that like really sells it is the fact that like we see glimpses of how she's responsible for so many things. So I feel like that kind of makes it more believable that she's going on this revenge quest and stuff, and she's got the resources. I think that's the thing that like would have been harder to sell if she just seems like just some kid like kind of. I mean, I think. Offline, we kind of talked a little bit about like kind of parallels between this and Terminator 2, where the John Connor character is starting to kind of really, and that of course is like where he has to start being prepped for this role of being leader of the free world, right, and stuff like that. And in some ways, we feel like kind of, Mattie Ross is like kind of more prepared, than, to do that than John Connor ever was and everything.
Oh yeah, no, she's very prim and proper and principled and intelligent and really plans out her stuff, unlike John Connor. But that's kind of the nice juxtaposition with John Wayne's, as Cogburn, because he's sort of the lovable rogue who works outside the normal rules of society, which is is kind of cynical and everything else, which is what makes the dialogue, and from my opinion, in the original so much better, because you've got this interplay of someone who's very, very sort of moral and principled, and someone who is much more morally ambiguous and doesn't necessarily work on any principles, really. So that was really effective, and I think it's something that kind of was missing in the remake for me. They didn't build enough of that strength of the character of Mattie into the remake's lead role. In fact, I kind of felt like whilst they made it more realistic with her age, they didn't really build enough of her strength of character. I mean, there wasn't the dialogue there. You didn't really feel like she could hold her own against the adults, whereas, I mean, even though the 1969 Mattie is quite considerably older than 14, as I think you've got, but you get this idea she could quite easily outwit either of the two bounty hunters that she's with.
Yeah, it's interesting how so much of what works and like kind of or needed to work was hinged on selecting the right actress for Mattie's character.
Yeah.
Kim Darby like kind of definitely has strong performance, even though that like Hailee Stanfield apparently is the one that won an Oscar and everything like that.
Did she win an Oscar for that?
Or let me see. I have to like now I have to kind of double check my facts and stuff like that. But I know she definitely got nominated. Let me see if I kind of not talking totally out of my butt.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know it did. After I read more about the remake, I realized it got nominated for a lot of awards. I don't necessarily follow the Academy Awards too closely, but I know it did got a lot of critical and award style praise. But yeah, I mean, just while you're looking that up,
she was nominated for the
okay.
the best supporting actress. Yeah.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, I mean, if anything, too, like it probably would be worse if she did win because, like, when you win an Oscar as a 14-year-old, like, where can you go, right? You put down from there. So it's really, like that's one of those things that, like, when you peak too early, you can kind of really work against you, kind of thing. So
yeah, I mean, to be fair though, I don't think I've actually ever heard of her acting in anything else. Although,
right,
maybe I'm not. Yeah, again, it goes back to our thing of child stars like it.
Yeah. That's a whole other
discussion. Whole other thing, right? But yeah, so that was the real thing that was very obvious for me was this interplay of the prim and proper, principled girl and the Captain Jack Sparrow of the Western world. That's kind of how I saw him. But yeah, I mean, Terminator 2 is sort of slightly similar as well. And you've got a tenacious 14-year-old kid. Right. And the Terminator, in a way, is a kind of similar character in that he's kind of this killing machine who works outside the bounds of normally acceptable behavior in society.
Right.
And he's got to use, and the kid kind of like gives him the moral compass.
Right. So yeah, that's
it's
true.
Kind of, there are definitely sort of similar themes in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to the thing that we talked about before about like, I wonder how much of like kind of different times people steal like kind of ideas from each other and stuff like that, and certainly we can't point to anything directly like kind of that was stolen because it's not that obvious stuff, but certainly I feel like different times these are kind of just that thing of where you get ideas right from each other kind of thing and stuff. So
yeah, I mean, speaking of which, I mean, obviously the remake is much more realistic than the 1960s. I was
going to say.
Which is very kind of a romanticized Western movie. And I almost feel like because it's at the tail end of the popularity of Westerns, it's almost like a culmination of all the romanticism that's been built up over the decades of stuff. There's just, these glorious sort of colorful vistas and, it's almost like not exactly comedy, but it's quite a light-hearted movie compared to the Coen Brothers remake. But it just has this whole kind of feeling of slickness. And I couldn't help noticing as well, like John Wayne's outfit. If you took away the cowboy hat and eye patch, his outfit almost looks like someone who's about to go racing a sports car along the French Riviera. He's wearing like this satin shirt with a neckerchief and really rather nice suede jacket. I thought, if he just did that, he could be enjoying his Sunday afternoon drive in his Ferrari or something. So the whole thing just felt way too slick, really.
And it's interesting how, even though it's the one role that he's won an Oscar for, he actually apparently says it is his least favorite out of the different ones that he's done and stuff like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, he does have quite a sort of, he's one of those actors who just plays the same kind of role over and over again. But he does it with, I think that he has such charisma. It's like, I haven't really seriously watched a John Wayne movie. And I was really taken aback by how much he commands the presence on the movie. He kind of eats his way through the scenery, but he's very kind of charming in the role. And and his interactions with Mattie really do add a lot of depth. And it's a really great performance, actually. I could fully get behind giving him an Oscar for it.
And I feel like in some ways, it's kind of like that art reflecting life kind of thing where, he's had his heyday, so to speak, in Westerns and stuff like that, because the Western movies have really peaked and stuff like that. And so in a way, Rooster Cogburn is this guy who's at the end of his kind of like end of the road, so to speak, in terms of his gunfighting days. So and here's this kind of aging star, right, who's like kind of towards the end of his movie career and stuff. So I feel like kind of in some ways there's kind of weird parallel that sometimes I don't know if it's conscious or it's unconscious, but I feel like different times we see like kind of something on the screen that kind of reflects what's happening in life and stuff like that. And,
yeah, not only John Wayne. I mean, westerns as a whole genre. You could almost say they're the ones over the hill waving goodbye at the end.
Right. There's only like I think only a few more other westerns made in that year, whereas like kind of years before there were like dozens. Like kind of each year there were like like at least like a couple dozen movies per year or something like that. So it's interesting how then trickled off.
Yeah, I mean, you have said it in the offline stuff that we, this was pretty much the end of the westerns as an era. And what was it that really caused that? And that was something that really got me thinking, what was it that replaced it? So I started looking at what was the highest box office grossing films in the early 70s. And it seemed to be that, you've got The Godfather, Serpico, various kind of crime and gangster movies seemed to kind of turn up. So on a very superficial level, it seems like people went from playing cowboys and Indians to cops and robbers,
Right.
And then I think what really was the nail in the coffin was probably Star Wars, because that's like, first movie is more or less cowboys and Indians in space, right? So that really did it. And that's why I kind of felt it was so cynical to make the movie Cowboys and Aliens, because it's just like, okay, we've analyzed this. We know that this was a successful genre. We know this was the one that's planted it. Let's try and do the two and make something, completely marketing driven. But
it seems to come in cycles too, because like we had westerns with this kind of black and white kind of compass and stuff like that. Then it shifted like to the kind of more ambiguous morality of the 70s and stuff. And then, like you said, Star Wars seemed to kind of kick off in this kind of new reemergence of like kind of our desire for something kind of where the fantasy genre kind of really, other than horrors, which we talked about, like kind of having their heyday in the 80s, but like fantasy movies really kind of kicked off again, like kind of in the we wanted more of the black and white kind of morality and stuff like that. And then we went into the 90s and we kind of again went back to like kind of just things kind of being more ambiguous and kind of darker and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I would say the late 70s, that was really when sci-fi really started to take off.
Yeah.
But it allowed you to retell some of those older stories just in a different context.
And the thing is, though, the remake, like kind of, for all the things that kind of may have worked, it didn't work and stuff like that, it was a fairly successful movie. I mean, in the box office, which kind of is striking, because here's a Western, right? Like kind of in a field, and maybe that's it, like where just because like, there aren't many Westerns being made nowadays. So I guess in some ways, like kind of, people kind of go, oh, what's this? A Western, what is that? Like kind of, they're playing cowboys and Indians.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Coen Brothers have got enough sort of films under their belt that they can go for something slightly out of the ordinary, and they'll still get enough hype and enough sort of critics thinking, oh, this is a good idea when they do something like that. But just one last thing on the death of the Western, so to speak, is this. I wonder if it's also tied to, with the Vietnam War, you've got a lot of kind of anti-American sentiment, people coming back and being disillusioned with America. And the Western is very much a kind of iconic American genre, not really international. And I wonder if that kind of maybe more cynical 70s anti-American kind of attitude is what really kind of killed it off as well.
Yeah, you have to kind of wonder about that. One of the kind of authors that I kind of was listening to her biography about was Joan Didion, and she had this thing for John Wayne for some reason and stuff. Like she like really like idolized him, and so it's kind of weird that even though she was the voice of this generation, right, that's kind of like the post baby boomers, like kind of 70s stuff like that. and very much the age that we're talking about. And then, but meanwhile, who she longed for, like kind of, you almost feel like that song, "Where Did All the Cowboys Go?" Like kind of that almost seems to be her song and stuff, because of the way she wrote about how this kind of the mystique or the different things of the Old West are just kind of missing in our culture and stuff like that. So I think it's like kind of this weird mix of like kind of on the one hand, it's like kind of we are disillusioned, we kind of left those kind of different ideas behind or kind of like tossed them aside. But meanwhile, there's this kind of nostalgia, this kind of wish for wanting those things to come back and stuff. And I think, I don't know, maybe in some ways is the absence or fondness going with absence of stuff.
Well, I think what the kind of vibe I got from the 1960s version was because of the snappy kind of dialogue, but the general kind of easygoing nature of it. It reminded me of, films like Bringing Up Baby and stuff like this. Films that are very much kind of like the interplay of the relationship, and the dialogue is the real kind of like thing you're watching it for, rather than the action and the violence. But to be fair though, what was interesting about this, you had Robert Duvall and Dennis Hopper in the movie.
Yeah.
And they actually do, I would say though, that's like Dennis Hopper's death scene was a little lackluster. But, they still did a great job of really adding this, level of 70s sort of gritty authenticity in a movie that's otherwise a kind of an easygoing bank holiday Monday movie, as I would call it in England, the kind of one you just sit on, put it in the afternoon and relax to.
And it's kind of striking also for the very reason that like, here are two actors, right, who they're about to rise in both the genres we talked about, like kind of Robert Duvall with like kind of, The Godfather, the whole gangster thing and stuff. And Dennis Hopper with the whole drug culture, hippies kind of, easy rider kind of thing and stuff. So I think it's interesting how like, here are these actors in these minor roles and they're about to kind of really take off. And
let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Yeah, before the unintentional break and stuff like that, we started talking about how, it's interesting also where here you have two actors in minor roles, but, whose careers are about to take off in the very genres that we were talking about that like really ruled the 70s, right? Of, like Robert Duvall going to the whole gangster kind of, cops and robbers kind of thing. And then Dennis Hopper about to basically, like kind of, take off and Easy Rider and kind of the whole hippie kind of culture vibe. And so, yeah, it's interesting how they're in these minor roles in the more traditional Western kind of setting, but then their careers about to really be a part of like the whole change in cinema.
Yeah. Now, if I can lead back to the remake here, I will go with my pet peeve on it, because the thing for me with this movie was that, you've got these directors who are very sort of critically acclaimed, and you've got, not one, but three sort of big movie stars in this movie, Josh Brolin, Matt Damon, and Jeff Bridges. And I mean, for me, this is one of those movies that got loads of critical acclaim, but I just do not see how this happened. It was, for me, I felt like Jeff Bridges was drinking or smoking or eating his way through the lines. I couldn't understand what he was saying half the time. And he was trying to sort of, whereas the structure of the dialogue had this kind of authentic structure to it in the original, with some of the backwards and forwards. With this one, it was just sort of, I felt like the Coen Brothers had turned around to them and said, okay, the dialogue's maybe not quite as snappy as the 1969 version. You're going to have to do something weird with your voices in order to make this more compelling and authentic. So, I just was really disappointed by that. And then Matt Damon gets his tongue shot half the way through. So now he's like sort of going, and then you've got Josh Brolin, who's sort of has this really weird, I can't even describe it. Again, it's just like the school of silly accents. It just, I didn't understand. I think that was possibly my least favorite Josh Brolin role.
Yeah.
Because he deviated from someone who sort of seemed to talk normally to someone who was kind of like the village idiot, sort of going, to me. And it just, the whole thing just, it's one of those things that I see, oh God, Venom guy, Bane guy, Tom Hardy. Yeah. So it seems like Tom Hardy just decides, okay, this role, I'm going to put on this particular accent for it. And I'm going to commit to that type of speaking all the way through, regardless of if it's, you know, incomprehensible, just to be so authentic and method actor. And this was kind of what I felt. It was all kind of for effect, but, you know,
I mean, if you go with like kind of the makers of Deadwood, they would say like, you know, hey, that's just how things were in the Old West. The people were incomprehensible. Like, kind of, that's part of, you know, that time frame or something. I don't know. Like, I kind of, for me, it was definitely like kind of where you have to either turn up the volume, or other times I just turn on the subtitle just to understand sometimes what was being said, to be honest.
Yeah, with the 1969, I had to suspend my sort of belief and accept the unrealistic nature of the whole movie, whereas with the remake, I had to sort of even just sort of suspend the belief about what they were actually saying and just sort of accept it was being authentic.
Right.
For me, it just seemed like such a shame, because there was obviously really good dialogue in the book and really good dialogue in the original, and it just seemed totally unnecessary to me. But one person that really shone for me was Barry Pepper, who played Ned. His performance is fantastic in the remake. He really put all of the other stars to shame. In my
I feel like he's this underrated actor. Like, kind of different times, whenever he shows up, he always like kind of gives a really strong performance that kind of just stands out. But yet he doesn't seem to ever get like kind of these major roles for some reason. Like, you never see him like kind of as a lead or anything. So I don't know. Maybe you know, if you're kind of casting, you know, you got our votes for Barry Pepper and being some more juicier roles and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. More pepper on that one, please. So, but yeah, I also felt like Hailee. I mean, I know she's 14. Hailee Stanfield, I want to say.
Yeah.
I just felt they could have. I felt like her performance was kind of rushed, and it didn't really. She didn't give enough sort of gravitas or punctuate the dialogue enough.
I guess I really was willing to suspend a lot, because like I kind of, maybe part of me like just simply, you know, this was like the remake was the first version I watched, and the fact that like it was like kind of like unexpected for me, like kind of, wow, she's 14-year-old and stuff like that, and she's doing really well for her first major role. And I guess for me, like I guess I feel like I didn't have a objective or unbiased view and stuff. It was hard for me, because I kind of appreciated the fact that like she, you know, like kind of just came out of nowhere, and you know, she's thrown into her first major role, and I felt like kind of like, you know, because again, like going back a little bit to what we were saying about child actors and stuff, they say in Hollywood like two things, like, you know, never work with child actors and never work with animals and stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, she like kind of, to me, like I felt like she just demonstrated a lot of maturity for somebody who is, you know, like kind of you know, again, I hope she does do more and kind of you know, goes in the better path for, you know, like kind of child actors. But you know, that I guess that's was my kind of unbiased view, I guess, of her performance.
Yeah. No, it's certainly not easy. That's not for me. I'll take a young 21-year-old anytime. I think, to be honest with you.
So
movie, but yeah.
So like, what did you feel like kind of was the main things about Mattie Ross, besides like kind of, you know, the performance and stuff? But I felt like, you know, either actress though, like kind of be able to kind of convincingly, you know, speak in that kind of more formal way, like convincingly. I think that was like an important part of it. Like that, like a lot of it was the dialogue, where as long as they didn't stumble over it, like the dialogue itself was like kind of very much had this kind of unique voice that like you just felt like it was Mattie Ross, like kind of regardless of the actress that was playing it. So
yeah, no, I mean, I think that style of the, you know, very formal dialogue is not easy by any standards to reproduce well and effectively. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's very indicative of maybe the times in the South, and I think that plays into her intelligence as a character, that she can talk to people in this way. So yeah, I mean, I'm being kind of inadequate about talking about it, unfortunately, but I mean, yeah, I suppose it's difficult because I really feel like after seeing the 1969 version, I really wanted more from the modern one, but I mean, it was, yeah, definitely not an easy role or anything to come by. But I mean, in terms of one thing I did notice in the remake was they made a point of surrounding Mattie in death, basically. Like and I don't know if this is also in the book, but she sleeps with the corpses at the beginning.
Yeah.
He has to cut down that corpse from the tree, and then she's also got to pull the. She's trying to get the knife from the corpse at the end out of the snake pit. So the whole time they're saying this 14-year-old kid has gone on this journey for revenge and has to sort of face death, but very much literally in it all the way through. So they kind of made that much more visual in the remake. And
like you said, like kind of there was different sacrifices, right, between the original and remake. Whereas in the remake, she ultimately ended up sacrificing her arm and stuff. And then I guess in the original, it was a sacrifice of LeBoeuf's character, I guess. And,
yeah, that was an interesting decision. I didn't expect that in the 1969 version. Because they say that the tone, it kind of came out of nowhere a little bit because the tone was quite light. And yeah, the remake is closer to the book from what I understand. So it's kind of like all this sin, your revenge comes due and it has a price, which is kind of what we see in Old Boy as well.
Right.
No one leaves unscathed, basically.
Well, what's also kind of a funny connection with that is that what we're really seeing too is Mattie going through this kind of hero's journey, right? And which different times, like kind of as Joseph Campbell talks about, is really tied also to what happens to a boy becoming a man, that he has to go through this cycle of basically dying, and like kind of that there's this kind of has to be this some kind of ritual of death and stuff like that before he was really becoming a man and stuff. And so here we have this girl becoming a woman, and whereas like kind of a lot of the typical thing of especially nowadays, it's like the girl having her first period and stuff is like kind of considered like, oh, now she's a woman, stuff like that. But in this situation, she's not only like kind of dealing death and stuff, but she's also like kind of ultimately ends up losing her limb, like kind of. So I think that's like kind of an interesting kind of way that this idea is kind of put out and stuff like that for.
Part of the person sort of has to die to move on, so to speak, from a person's perspective. I mean, I think it's the book would I'm trying to think whether it does, from what I read anyway, whether it deals with her sort of transition to womanhood more obviously than the movies do, because I think it's quite subtle in both movies, really.
And I think it's striking how, I guess in both versions, they really don't take her seriously initially, like for a lot of, like kind of the early parts, right, where they keep kind of telling her, go home, and stuff like that. And I think that's one thing that like is definitely strikingly different from the hero's journey, is how there's a lot more of the resistance of the call. But whereas here, like, Mattie's like diving, like kind of, feet first, like kind of, and she's like not only ready to go, but she's like kind of, just 7 in the morning, right? Like trying to get Cogburn up and stuff like that. So I think that's like a interesting kind of switch, I guess, or flipping the script on that idea. And then as things go on and everything, of course, like kind of the ultimate thing is that she's about to die, and again, spoiler alert, plenty of bound stuff. Cogburn like kind of basically brings her back to life like literally, like kind of by taking
Yeah.
her to help and stuff like that. So we have this kind of, along with revenge, there's redemption that where, you know, he's basically like, you know, initially this drunk with like, you know, very little purpose and stuff. And it's, you know, as we've talked about like in, a little bit offline and stuff like that, about how his role as the surrogate father is kind of like part of what, um, like literally bringing her back to life to kind of, you know, her new life, I guess, if you will, as now a woman and stuff. So I think that's like kind of an interesting kind of part about how he's not just simply like kind of just somebody kind of helping her to track down the killer, but he ends up being like kind of this person who helps her through this transition from being, you know, going from being a girl to being a woman and stuff.
Yeah, and she's also the moral compass for him.
Yeah.
Even after she because he joins the circus presumably to do sort of trick shot shooting rather than shooting people on a regular basis. So
Right.
that obviously has that lasting effect on him.
Yeah, that was an interesting choice too, right? Like kind of, you know, in the original, he just kind of rides off with the sunset, so we kind of imagine he continues doing the martial thing or whatever. But then in the remake, yeah, he ends up joining the circus, you know, which she teases LeBoeuf's character, you know, Matt Damon's character in the,
right.
you know, like when she says something about like we have no rodeo clowns and, you know,
that's right, yeah. And he turns into one, yeah. The other thing that we kind of, just a side thing, is like I thought it was kind of strange that initially when he said, oh, well, you know, the French called it LeBoeuf, but I call it LeBoeuf, which I thought was just, it's a very odd line, but it's from the book, but it's really, I mean, I presume that he does that to appear less sort of French and from this Creole kind of roots, trying to sort of,
yeah.
That's kind of what I got from that.
We haven't talked much about LeBoeuf or like
no, we haven't actually.
So yeah, other than him like kind of coming along for the ride, why does he? Yeah, why is he there? Really there? Do you think? Like, kind of, what's his significance in terms of his role for, you know? Because we talked about like kind of Cogburn as like kind of the surrogate father and stuff like that. And he starts off being kind of like a little bit seemed like the clown, but he's not though.
No. I mean, I think he's there as a sort of a tool to sort of indicate that, you know, young women shouldn't just trust some good-looking potential suitor because they might have other ulterior motives, which is kind of what they're implying by him trying to take back Cheney for the higher reward in Texas. And that there isn't much substance to show, or to showing off. You know, you've got to prove yourself in the actual field as a hero, so to speak, to be a worthy kind of guy. That was the kind of what I got from his character. For me, in the remake as well, I felt they were a bit too heavy-handed with this kind of like, well, 1 minute she's on the beef side, 1 minute she's with Cogburn's side, and the original was much more kind of subtle in that respect.
And there was this kind of weird thing that they were doing, like the very first scene that we see him with Mattie and stuff like that. He says something about like kind of, you know, I had the mind to like kiss you or something, like kind of was this kind of weird kind of pedophilia kind of thing and stuff, where it was kind of like I didn't know where that came from, but you know, I guess in some ways maybe it was a reflection of the fact that, like, I mean, you know, back then, like, I guess they, you know, pretty much would have taken, you know, like kind of, you know, somebody who's just, I guess, any
pubescent,
pubescent
start considering them for a wife, right?
For a wife, yeah.
I think it's just because, of course, I mean, that's the weird thing. It's like it seems sort of odd and out of place, and I think again it's just the author, considering it was 1968, saying, you know, this is just another indication of how different things were back then.
Right. Yeah, I mean that definitely does kind of stand out. Like, and I guess in reality too, we kind of like went, you know, like here and there during that time period too, right? Where I want to say that like it was the late 70s that they raised the drinking age again and stuff like that, and like we kind of like in the 50s and 60s pretty much, I don't know, like it seemed like after a certain point, like once somebody, like a teen, like kind of was quote unquote mature enough, then they were okay for drinking, right, and stuff. And but they kind of delay it as much as possible. But like that was like kind of one of the um, transitions or the passages, right? That like if you were old enough to go to war, you were old enough to drink, kind of thing, stuff.
Yeah.
But then they kind of went back to, or it kind of like flipped again, like kind of later on to like kind of they raised the drinking age and stuff because we realized, oh well, like somebody who can drive a car may not necessarily be mature enough to kind of make their decisions about getting behind the wheel with after drinking and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the difference between I guess the States, because everyone has to drive. Well, it's such a car culture that it's that's why I guess the drinking age stayed lower in Europe.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Like kind of I know that from what I've heard about like kind of the cultures there, pretty much if you were old enough to sit at the adults table, you were old enough to have a drink and stuff. So
yeah. So which version did you prefer out of the two?
I have to say that like I really like the stylized, the realistic nature of the remake and stuff. So I feel like that was one of the ones that like to me, if nothing else, it made that story more accessible to people. I feel like that was like a good reason to do a remake and stuff. Whereas I can definitely see like kind of different pros and like why the original is such a classic and stuff. Besides John Wayne, it's just also like kind of like it was in some ways an homage to westerns in their heyday and that kind of thing. But I feel like without kind of having the Coen Brothers touch to everything, that story probably would have been forgotten. Like I mean, people probably nowadays rarely would touch a like a western and stuff like that. Except for the people who are somehow pick up a taste for it or kind of maybe for nostalgic reason or like in our case like kind of research reason and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of, for me, I generally was behind most of the ideas of the remake. As I say, my main criticisms were the lack of the snappy dialogue and the silly voices. If they got rid of that, I would have been totally on board. But the other thing I just kind of, I don't know, I kind of like just movies from the 60s and the 70s anyway. And funnily enough, the Elmer Bernstein, Don Black title song from the 1969 one has been going around in my head relentlessly.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I just have like the True Grit theme going on in my head all the time, and it's very random. But yeah. So the other point I wanted to make out, which I just sort of, and I've told you this before, but I kind of think Joe Scarborough from Morning Joe channeled John Wayne, or at least he did when he first started on MSNBC in 2012, because he was kind of this Republican who was wading into enemy territory, guns all pointed at him. And if you look at his sort of mannerisms, he really does feel like he's about to tell LeBoeuf to drop that switch. That's almost exactly how Joe Scarborough was on Morning Joe for a while. He's not so much now because it's blatant that he's not a Republican really, and he's married to Mika Brzezinski and things. But what I kind of notice is, especially with politicians, is this thing of they almost adopt a character that people are familiar with, like Boris Johnson right now. With all the Brexit chaos that's going on, I really feel he borrows his character from Winston Churchill, and he delivers a lot of his political addresses in a similar sort of way. And he's almost like whilst Winston Churchill was at war with Germany, and now we're at war with Europe. I kind of get the same kind of vibe from him, Yeah. So, but that was just one thing that's very obvious to me. That's on a side note, yeah.
So I think maybe in kind of a closing thing, like when we talk about True Grit, then like that idea or that concept itself, how do you feel like kind of in the end it's like kind of the story kind of reflects what True Grit is and stuff?
Yeah, I mean the meaning of True Grit, it's sort of like regardless, for me, it's summed up in Cogburn's character in that you're regardless of your history or your methods and what people's interpretations of them, you have a fairly strong moral compass and you stay kind of true to what you think is right, which is pretty consistent with what that character does.
Yeah, and I think for me, like there's you have to have some kind of compass, and the other part of that is like kind of the backbone or something to kind of stay the course, like, you know, because it's one thing to kind of like that you're willing to kind of stay pointed in a direction, but I think a lot of times what we see, and probably a lot less of nowadays and stuff like that, is conviction or willingness kind of stay the course and stuff. And for me, like kind of, you know, Mattie Ross, like she was the kind of, you know, the true grit in the sense of where, you know, she like, I'm going to get my dad's killer. Like kind of, you know, like that was her, you know, thing to it. And whether it was kind of riding through the river with a horse that probably could, you know, seem like it barely, you know, swim across to even in the end, ultimately losing a limb and stuff like that. She was going to, you know, she was not going to, she was going to do it at all costs kind of thing and stuff.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it is definitely Mattie Ross is the.
No. I mean, I'm just saying like that to me like kind of is the other part about it. Like kind of, you know, it's and you know, certainly I feel like that's like kind of the core of the story was kind of like where you know, Cogburn, like kind of like you said, you know, he was hired for his true grit and stuff, but he already had it and stuff. And then, you know, here was Mattie Ross, like kind of, you know, I feel like
she acquires it.
She had to acquire it, yeah. And that was her journey, like kind of, you know, going from being a girl to being a woman, stuff like that, was developing grit, or true grit for that matter. And I feel like that was like kind of, you know, part of the point of, you know, why we go on this journey with her and stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One other point, I was kind of curious as to why the Coen Brothers chose to remake this movie in 2010. And and one thing that is more emphasized in the remake is the court case. And there's this, if you know, the writ with the rat, this is the scene where he shoots the rat in the original, is his frustration with this lack of, you know, due process doesn't work, or there's something that's inherently wrong with it. And I wondered whether, you know, in the light of, you know, what is the law in Florida where you can basically sort of shoot first, defend yourself.
Right, I know what you're talking about.
Trayvon Martin case, you know.
Yeah.
That it made me wonder whether they looked at that and said, you know, I mean, it was before the Trayvon Martin case, but I wonder if it was somewhat this kind of look at due process and does it actually work?
Right.
Whether that was a sort of an inspiration to do it. It may be totally unrelated, but I was just trying to think about what would make it sort of relevant with problems of the time. Right.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like kind of like you said, I didn't come across anything that kind of talked about the Coen Brothers. It just seemed like overall, from what you know, I did read about kind of their process or the kind of what they, you know, decided like kind of was they wanted to do something kind of to revisit that story and stuff like that. I didn't see anything that kind of like my sense was that like they did find that like here was this story, like specifically the novel and stuff that like they felt was more relevant again. And I don't know, like kind of that like what, you know, they didn't really get too much into specifics about why that was and stuff. So, but yeah, definitely that's something that I would love to kind of find out more about as well. So
yeah. But if I ever bump into the Coen Brothers, it'll be top of my list to ask them. But, however unlikely that may be. But yeah. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to delve into with this one, or
I think for me it's probably more about like you know, just probably, you know, next kind of things that we want to cover. Or you know, certainly there is possibility kind of looking at more kind of non-sci-fi, non-genre kind of stories and stuff like that. We are like this will probably air like I guess the 14th. So we are coming into the holidays, which then kind of brings to mind like, you know, we can certainly do some holiday themed remakes and originals and stuff. It's a Wonderful Life being one of the ones towards the top of that list and stuff. There's discussion down the road about redoing Home Alone. That's not been done yet, but I just kind of, that makes me think about like kind of like what movies that like we hope never get remade, like kind of, or just shouldn't be touched stuff, and that's a whole kind of worm discussion, I think.
Yeah. I think maybe we could almost do a top 10 movies that should be remade. But,
right.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think what else we've actually got coming out in the cinema. There's the new Star Wars movie, obviously, but they've not remade it. They've just done continuations of it. I'm pretty much open to any suggestions really for remakes. Whatever. Although I do want to do Black Christmas. That's the one that I really want to do.
Okay.
The Christmas-based, apparently the first slasher movie. So that's the only one I'm really interested in. Okay.
Sounds good. There's certainly ones that are like kind of more, like slow burn, so to speak, or like kind of long term, because like ones like Battlestar Galactica, they've got a whole season's worth.
I know.
Actually, multiple seasons worth and stuff. So yeah, so we'll have to like kind of keep those on the back burner, I guess, until we're kind of more ready to kind of to cover that one, and that'll be like kind of the epic ones that we will have to kind of prepare like kind of for a marathon version of watching those.
That's right. Yeah. No, and I mean, any that come to mind immediately other than It's a Wonderful... Well, I mean, do you want to do it? It's a Wonderful Life next?
That definitely is towards the top. I try to think of anything else that kind of... the one that, like, did strike me as kind of funny that, like, I think it's somewhat appropriate for the holidays, because I feel like that's a series that we do tend to watch during that time, is the James Bond one, the Casino Royale. That is one that I feel like, I feel like around the holidays we seem to always watch more James Bond movies. Like, I mean, at least for me, like, I feel like that's one of those things that like we tend to have in the background when like kind of everyone's kind of milling around or celebrating and stuff.
Well, I mean, certainly, I spent a large proportion of my 20s rewatching James Bond movies over and over again. So I'm always game for watching a James Bond movie.
Okay. Sounds good. Alrighty, so we'll have to kind of like just decide what's called do like an internal vote, and then we'll kind of also like see if we get put some feelers out for what other ones people want to hear more about and stuff. And then we'll definitely make sure we let folks know. So thanks for watching, everyone, and as always,
cool.
We'll catch you next time.
Cool. Thanks. Bye.